Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Dr. Robert Kelly, a University of Wyoming archaeologist, has identified 4 beginnings: technology, culture, agriculture, and state. Is there a 5th beginning, and is it underway? We'll visit with Dr. Kelly about his book, The 5th Beginning, What 6 Million Years of Human History Can Tell Us About Our Future. Next on Wyoming Chronicle.
Funding for this program was provided in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
We study the past in order to understand something about the future. For as long back as I can remember, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. Students learn how rock breaks as the first step to understanding how to interpret stones that archaeologists recover from archaeological sites. People think of stone tool technology as crude, and yet it was a technology that helped humanity survive for millions of years. I want to understand how humans became cultural. That process, which happened, I think, between 100 and 200,000 years ago. Why did evolution select that? All of the material indicators are telling us that we're about to go through a massive transition in the organization of human society. There is a big change coming, and it could be magnificent. And young people today have the potential to play starring roles in that change.
And we're pleased now to be joined by Dr. Robert Kelly from the University of Wyoming. Dr. Kelly, we'll have a chance to talk about your book, The 5th Beginning, and what 6 million years of human history tells us about our future in just a moment. But before we get into your book, which is a fascinating read, I want to talk about you and why archaeology, and why are you here at the University of Wyoming?
Well, I actually can't remember a time when I didn't want to be an archaeologist. It's been my interest ever since I was just a small boy. And when I was 16 years old, back in 1973, I had the opportunity to go work on an archaeological project in central Nevada. And I became associated with the man who was running that project, and I continued to work with him for years after that until I began doing my own research. And he and I, in fact, co-authored textbooks together today. So we've had about a 45-year collaboration. So it was a great piece of luck. And it certainly convinced me, that first summer convinced me that I wanted to be an archaeologist. And it also convinced me that I wanted to work in the West. It took me a while to sort of get here permanently, but I came to Wyoming about 20 years ago and have been working in the state ever since then.
I should tell our viewers, Dr. Kelly truly is one of the preeminent archaeologists in the country. You are a treasure here in the state of Wyoming.
Thank you.
And now you've written this book.
Mm-hmm.
What's the genesis for The 5th Beginning?
Every archaeologist will tell you that we study the past in order to know something about the future. But I have to admit that in my field, very few have actually tackled that question head on. And so some years ago, I decided it was time for me to put up. I had to think about what the past had to say about the future, and that's the genesis of the book.
And you start with this beginning that's surprising to me. You label technology.
The book makes use of of archaeology's strengths. Archaeology is not very good at getting at the fine details of the past. Those really elude us. What we're really good at, though, is seeing long-term trends in human history and looking at these over vast reaches of space. And we're the only field that can really do this because most of human history is not written down, is not preserved in documents. It's only preserved in things in the ground. So when I ask, what does the past tell us about the future, I try and use archaeology's strength of looking at long reaches of time, in this case all of human history, all 6 million years of it, and look at the entire globe. And when I do that, I see there are 4 major times when the basic character of human life changed. It went through a transition, what I call beginnings. And these are each marked by a radical transition in the material signature of humanity. The first of these, which happened about 3.3 million years ago, is the origins of technology. Humans had been around as a very interesting primate since about 6 million years ago, when we split off from the line that would become chimpanzees and bonobos. And about 3 million years ago, one of those primates began fashioning stone tools. And those changed everything. They probably allowed us to switch to doing much more hunting or much more scavenging of animal carcasses on the African plains.
Tools were created.
Tools were created.
As we saw, very similarly to what we saw in the open with students manufacturing tools.
Very similar to those. They were very simple tools, but probably effective for the task they were designed for. And they were probably also wooden tools, maybe very, very simple spears that went along with these. We don't find those because they don't preserve. That technology made us very successful, and we know it made us successful because the primates holding stone tools in their hands are the ones who spread out of Africa throughout Europe and Asia about 1.5 million years ago.
After this beginning of technology, we move or advance to now a beginning that you call culture.
Quite a long time passes between the first beginning, technology, and the second beginning, which is culture, the appearance of culture, which happens somewhere between 50 and 200,000 years ago, perhaps in various parts of Africa. And this is really the appearance of humans as we know them, because culture is what makes us human. It's the ability to use symbols. It's the ability to construct a world view of
Communication
life.
is enhancing in this period?
Communication is certainly enhanced, although we were probably speaking with using language before this. But with the appearance of culture, we're able to really think about the world as being something other than just what it appears to be materially. It's what allows us to see a group of other humans as being different than us, as belonging to a different tribe. It's what allows us to think about kinship categories. You belong to one clan, I belong to another clan. It's what allows us to tell stories. It's what allows us to tell lies. It's what allows us to use metaphors and analogies. It's what allows us to come to dream up myths and legends. It's marked by art, and it's marked by burials. Burials that have evidence of intentional ritual with them. People went through a ritual in order to send someone over to the other side. It's a sign of religion. It's a sign in a belief in something after death, which is the beginning of religious beliefs.
Next was the beginning of agriculture.
Agriculture is a major transition from hunting and gathering to an agricultural lifestyle. This is a dramatic change. And it really occurred fairly recently in human history. Only 10 to 12,000 years ago is when it began. It begins independently in different parts of the world.
And that's surprising to me that it began simultaneously yet independently.
Independently, exactly. And it all happens after 90% of the world is completely colonized by people as hunter-gatherers. People move out of Africa. There's a second wave out of Africa 60 to 70,000 years ago. They spread into Europe, across Asia, eventually up into the Arctic, into the Bering Strait, into North America, and in South America. People are in South America, and Tierra del Fuego, at the very tip of South America, about 10,000 years ago. Most of the world is colonized by these hunter-gatherers. It's soon after that that agriculture appears in different places. It's almost certain that that's a simple product of population pressure. The environment can't support people at a hunting and gathering economy, so people begin to make their environment produce more food. That's agriculture. They took certain plants, they enhanced their productivity, partly by choosing the right seeds and replanting those, and produced plants that were very, very productive, but that were also completely dependent on people for their propagation. That's really what domesticated means.
After agriculture, then we get into this thing called state.
It happens very quickly. The fourth beginning happens right on the heels of agriculture, and it's another dramatic transition. And this is a transition from relatively egalitarian life, or at least a life in which those with power were held in check somewhat.
Because of survival requirements, or do we know?
They were held in check by the population under them. They sort of maintained a position of authority, but if they tried to wield that authority too strongly, the population wouldn't allow them to do that. Something happens. Beginning around 5,000 years ago, it happened first in what today is Iraq and the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys, where there's a transition to the formation of a very elite class of people who were cut off from the rest of the population. They saw themselves as having no kin connection to that lower population. They justified their position, usually with some ideas about descent from the gods. That's why they're in power, because they're descended from the gods and you're not. And we see a hierarchy forming of 3 or 4 levels of control: a very elite at the top, a managerial class, usually a mercantile class, and then the vast number of people at the bottom who are workers.
You discuss how structures start to appear and enforce then this concept of state.
Each of these 4 previous transitions, the reason archaeologists recognize them is because they're marked by a change in the material signature of people. So the appearance of stone tools. We don't see those for the entire history of the world till about 3.3 million years ago, and suddenly we find stone tools, and they only become more and more common, and technology becomes more and more elaborate. The second transition, the appearance of culture, is marked by art, and it's marked by burials, which entail ritual, have the signs of ritual involved with them, which means people are thinking about an afterlife, which means people are thinking about religion.
Mm-hmm.
The third transition to agriculture is marked by the appearance of these domesticated plants, which have never existed before on the planet, along with bigger, more sedentary villages, more sedentary houses, a shift in the material signature. And the fourth transition is marked by large public architecture, some of it designed to shock and awe the population, but also neighbors, to demonstrate a ruler's power. I can build pyramids. Imagine how powerful I am. I can build palaces. I can fill it with musicians and artists and architects and scientists as well. Think of how powerful I am, because I can do all that and it does not harm me. This is what leaders were communicating through all of this very, very public display of power.
So, four beginnings.
Four beginnings.
Technology, agriculture, culture, and state.
The state.
And then around 1500 AD, you start to talk about maybe a fifth beginning.
Now, here's the hard part, is it's hard to recognize a transition if you're part of it.
Which we are.
Which we are. And so I had to think about this problem in terms of how would my archaeological colleagues 10,000 years in the future, if they're looking back on the past, they would look on today the way that I look on the Paleolithic societies of the past. Would they see evidence of a fifth transition? And remember, they're looking for evidence of a transition in the material record. So I have to look at the material record of humanity since the fourth transition and ask, would an archaeologist see another transition in the material signature of humanity? And I think the answer is yes, and it begins around AD 1500, and it has accelerated over the last 500 years.
One of the markers, and we'll start to talk about now what you perceive maybe the future might be like.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things you talk about in your final chapter is this escalating cost of war. Mm-hmm. Yet to me, if you're talking 1500 AD, this is a time of wars.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, we all know that there are tremendous resources poured towards defense
mm-hmm.
and war. You see a time when there is no more war.
I certainly hope so.
You're very optimistic.
I try to remain optimistic, in part because, as other historians of warfare have pointed out, the cost of war has been escalating really since the fourth beginnings. Over the last 5,000 years, the arms race is not a 20th century phenomenon. The arms race has been going on for thousands of years.
As you note in your book, I build a spear, you build a shield.
Yes.
And it escalates from there.
Yeah, and it just goes up and up and up. And in a sense, we all four of the previous beginnings are the product of these long-term processes that are going on. I think of them as currents under the ocean. You can't really see them happening, but at some point they jointly produce a tipping point, and things change. You shift from a non-cultural to a cultural being. You shift from a hunter-gatherer to an agriculturalist. You shift from egalitarian to very hierarchical societies. Those transitions have marked the nature of humanity. There's really no reason to think that we're done. It's over. We've reached the end of human evolution. There's no reason to think that. And if we look at the signs, the material signatures are telling us we're at another point of dramatic change. Shipwrecks, stuff on the moon, changes in the trace element composition of human bone that reflects a global food chain, the distribution of people of different genetic backgrounds all over the
You analyze your daily diet in your book.
Yeah, I analyze my daily diet, and it comes from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And this is all signaling that we're in the midst of a fifth beginning. It's another big transition. It's partly a product of just what do you get accustomed to. And the moving people around the globe and introducing different peoples into different areas, it's, for some people, the response is, this is scary. I don't know what these people are all about, and I don't know what's going on. But for other people, those differences are attractive. They're able to look past the surface differences and see the common humanity of these people. Best example is Doctors Without Borders. I mean, these are people who are coming from first world nations, from the developed countries, and they go to the worst places in the world. Why? Because those are their neighbors. They're people in need.
Global neighbors.
They're their global neighbors. They see no difference between the people down the street and the people in the Sudan who desperately need medical help. Those are their neighbors, both of them. And that's a global community. The creation of social networks, Facebook, allows people to connect all over the world in large numbers instantly, so that people all over the world are playing soccer. People all over the world are listening to some of the same music. We are indeed creating a global culture and a global community, such that the differences will not, for the next generation, the differences will not be as significant as the similarities, the common humanity.
You perceive perhaps that the United Nations might be a driver of this.
The United Nations certainly recognizes this.
Yet, without the Security Council, perhaps we know it today.
The Security Council, in my opinion, is a problem, because they can veto anything. They can bring everything to a halt. That's fine if everyone on that council is going to be a good actor. They're not.
People watching today might think and might ask, how would the United States ever give up that power?
When I lecture about the fifth beginning, there are certainly people who say to me, that'll never happen. That'll never happen. A single global community, a global governing body, they say that'll never happen. 200 years ago, if I had told white people that someday African Americans would have all the same rights, at least on paper, as white people, that they'd be elected to office, and in fact, a black man would be elected to the highest office in the United States, they would have said, that'll never happen. 200 years to an archaeologist is like that.
I want to finish wrap up our discussion with the concept of global commerce. Mm-hmm. You perceive that as changing. Is capitalism also perhaps changing in this fifth beginning?
Capitalism is an economic system that it does good and bad. It can be highly exploitative of populations, because for capitalist economies to make money, to make profit, they have to find cheap sources of labor. So they're often exploiting labor. At the same time, though, capitalism tends to raise the standard of living in the nations that it's appeared in. So after World War II, we moved a lot of our labor to Japan. Japan's economy came up. We moved labor on to places like Singapore and South Korea. Those economies came up. Now the labor's moved into China and into India. We see the middle class there coming up. This is the benefit of capitalism. The last major landmass to be really fully infiltrated by this capitalist system is Africa. And it's already happening there. So what happens when all the cheap labor in the world is completely tapped out? Well, we actually already see what's happening, because it's happening back in the developed nations, where we see robotics and artificial intelligence coming in to replace labor. So what happens when you live in a world where there's no need for labor? Oh, capitalism will have to change if nobody has the money to buy the products that the factories are producing. In the past, there's always been new economies that have formed to take the place, or to absorb the labor that's freed up by technology. Many economists are not sure that that's going to happen in the future, that new industries will simply jump right onto robotics and artificial intelligence. So economists are already thinking about what do you do in a world where labor isn't needed? And I don't know the answer. I'm an archaeologist.
You are refreshingly optimistic on humans' future. You are.
Well, I think one has to be optimistic for two reasons. One, our record of humanity is that we encountered problems and we solved the problems. We solved the problems by making not little tweaks in our system, but large, dramatic changes in how humans organize their lives. So the challenge is we have to do that as well. You can't expect to go back. You can't expect the status quo to just continue. We have to come up with something totally new, the way our predecessors came up with something totally new. We've got a good record to move on. I'm also optimistic because being extremely pessimistic, and many people who write about the future are terribly pessimistic about it, and they have good reason to be. I take an optimistic perspective because, to me, a pessimistic perspective leads to inaction. An optimistic one leads to action, to taking the movements that we have to take, making the changes we have to make in order to make the fifth beginning not only successful, but perhaps the most magnificent of all the transitions that humanity has been through. It's within our control, and that's never been the case in the past. Perhaps the next half century is going to be a very crucial time for whether we're going to make the fifth beginning the easy way or the hard way.
And let's hope that it's the easy way.
I hope it's the easy way, because the hard way will be very hard.
Dr. Kelly, you've read, I'm sure, Nick Bartos' review of your book, and he said this: above all, your book talks about archaeology in fluent and jargon-free language that will appeal to a very broad audience indeed. This isn't a book about the romance of archaeology or spectacular discoveries. It is, quite simply, the best essay on archaeology he's ever read. He hopes it becomes a classic. And I would encourage our viewers to take a look at the book if they have the opportunity. I will say it's the best book that I've read this year.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on Wyoming Chronicle.
Thank you.